Fields will revolutionize your motion graphics workflow because they offer tremendous power to control the strength of parametric modeling and animation effects. In fact, they're similar to falloffs from prior versions of Cinema 4D, but offer much more flexibility. And in addition to MoGraph and deformers, you can use them with vertex maps, selection sets, and volumes. In this video, though, we're going to focus on using fields with MoGraph and these bite-sized candies. And the first thing we're going to do is define a basic effect by adding a plane effector. Now, just as usual, you control what happens to these clones here in the parameter tab, and right now we're simply moving them up 100 units on the y-axis. I'm going to exaggerate the effect a bit and set this to 400 units. And just as in the past, we can control where this effect occurs in the Falloff tab. But now, instead of a simple drop-down with basic shapes, we have a fields interface. And all of the basic Falloff shapes are implemented here as field objects. So if I want a basic spherical falloff, I can simply add a spherical field. Down here I have access to the basic properties of the field, and in the case of the sphere, it's just the size. But then in the remapping tab, I get more control over the shape of the falloff. So of course I can adjust the overall strength. I can also adjust the inner offset, which works a lot like the falloff percentage in prior versions of Cinema 4D. With this at 100%, basically I'm going to affect all of the clones within the sphere equally. Or I can set this down to 0, and I'm going to get a smooth falloff from the center of the sphere to the edge. I can gain even more control over the shape of the falloff with these contour modes. There's a quadratic mode here for basic adjustment of the curve, or we can jump into the curve mode and use Cinema 4D's Spline UI to really dial in the shape of the falloff. And you'll notice that in addition to seeing the adjustments reflected live in the viewport, we also have this remapping curve that shows us how the falloff for this specific field is being affected. In addition to quadratic and curve, we have step and quantize modes, which allow you to get multi-stepped falloffs. Now, you may have noticed that in addition to adjusting the position of these clones, we're also tweaking the color as well. The effectors now have this fields color mode that allows us to set the color for these clones using the fields themselves. And in the case of the spherical field here, that's all defined within the color remapping tab. In this case, we're just using a basic color and setting the opacity based on the value of the field. We can also remap the values of the field to a gradient in order to easily colorize our clones. One of the real powerful aspects of fields is that they can be layered together. So we can add a box field here and use typical image blending modes to choose how to combine these together. So we can subtract this box from the spherical field, and now you can see that we can create a complex effect that combines both of these fields. And each of the fields has its own object within the object manager, so we can really easily manipulate each independently. And of course, down here in the field list, we can control whether each field layer is going to affect just the value of the clones or just the color of the clones, or it can affect both, of course. Let's take a look at one of the new falloff shapes in release 20, which is the Radial Field. And this gives us a falloff that is based on an angle around the center of the field. So we have a start and an end angle and a start and end transition. And then we can offset that effect around the center. We can also set multiple iterations in order to get spoked or pinwheel type of effects. One of the things that I find this field is really useful for is Piechart Effects. So we can set the start and end angle here to 360, and we get a smooth fall off around the center of the field. I'm going to disable the value here, so we're just affecting the color. And then within the color remapping tab, we can use that gradient control to define our pie slices. And this uses the new gradient interface in release 20, which offers a ton of flexibility. It integrates really well too with the color picker that was introduced a few versions ago. So I'm going to set up a few color swatches here and simply drag them up into the gradient to define my knots. And now I can multi-edit these knots. I can also right-click here and change the interpolation of all the knots to step. And we can go into each of the knots and dial in the specific percentage that applies to that pie slice. Now you might notice that there's a section here that is white, and that is because this gradient actually allows us to control the alpha as well. If we check the edit alpha box here, you can see the alpha channel that's applied, and this is great because it allows you to put other field layers underneath this field and have those colors show through. But in this case, we want to remove this and simply get the full color of our gradient. And of course, we can uncheck the Edit Alpha option in order to get back to the colors. I already showed you earlier that we can rotate this pie chart using this offset attribute, but another really cool option is the use of subfields. Some of the fields actually have specific attributes that can be modified by other fields. So you'll notice that there's a tab here for the offset. And if we go in here, we can actually use fields to control that attribute. So here are some field layers, and time is a really important one. We can simply add the time layer here, and we can animate this pie chart without using any keyframes. We can also get some interesting effects when we combine other field shapes. For instance, we can add a spherical field, and we can actually get a swirling effect as the strength of the offset increases from the center to the edge. And we can make that swirl go all the way to the center by reducing this inner offset all the way down to 0. Now, of course, we can combine multiple fields together. So if I enable the time again and multiply the spherical field, we can actually increase this swirling effect over time. Again, all without any keyframes. Now let's take a look at another exciting field type, which is the spline. Here I have a basic helix spline, and I can add this as a field simply by dragging it into the field list. And here you can see that we are defining a falloff along the length of the spline. We can also define a falloff based on a radius from the spline, or we can combine both of these effects together with the along and radius mode. And of course, there's curves here to adjust the actual shape of those falloffs. Another really exciting use for splines is as a mask. Here I have some text, and I'm simply going to drag that down to create a field shape. And we'll set this spline shape to the mask mode. And we're going to project this along the y-axis. And here you can see that we're able to use that text as a mask for our effect. And we can blur that to the outside of the spline shape, or we can have the falloff work to the inside of the spline shape. Let's take a look at one more field type, but first we need to add another spherical field, and we're going to simply animate this along that helix spline from earlier. So we'll quickly set up an animation, simply animating this along the spline. And you'll see that we've got a falloff effect. Again, one that's easier to achieve because each field has its own object in the object manager. But we also have the ability to adjust how these fields are applied using these modifier layers. And one of the most exciting modifier layers is Decay. This actually allows us to add something of a tail on our effect. So you can see that we're actually getting a fall off or trailing tail on the spherical effect, and we can turn on the color of the tail as well. Now, we can adjust the size of that tail using this effect strength, and if we set the effect strength all the way up to 100%, we can actually turn on these clones, turn on this effect with the fall off, and have it never actually turn off again. So this gives you just a taste of some of the great things that you can accomplish with the field system in Cinema 4D Release 20. I know I feel like a kid in a candy store, and I'm sure you will too. Make sure to watch all of our Release 20 Quick Start videos in order to see all that's in store.